Today I wanted to talk to you about one of the biggest mistakes I've made in gardening and how I've slowly been killing 2 of my citrus trees over the past year. It's no secret that I hate staking my trees the way you see this one right here. Typically whenever I plant trees, I try and do something like this where I have the 2 stakes on the side. That way the trunk can get stronger over time. These 2 trees that you see in the wine barrels were the 2 original trees for the entire garden. Before I had a whole orchard of potted trees, I only ever planned to have these 2 because my husband really wanted them. So this one is a bear's lime tree and this one is a clementine tree. And right now they look a lot taller than they did before. The trees were a lot shorter. These are the oldest trees in the garden, and while they are semi-dwarfs, they weren't growing adequately. For the longest time, they had very little leaves and they continued to drop them time and time again, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong. Even in past vlogs, you guys might have seen I was always worrying about them. The only thing is I was worrying about the wrong thing. When we first planted these trees, I had never before planted a tree in my life. I didn't know what type of soil they needed and I didn't know how deep to plant them. And so when we mixed up the soil, it was a combination of peat moss, vermiculite, and compost. So instead of mixing the soil separately and then adding them to the pots, we try to mix it up in the pots for the trees. We were already so tired from doing everything else in the garden. At that point in time, I was very pregnant. We just did the best we could. Since then, I've potted over 20 trees, so I know exactly what texture to look for. I know what it is that I need in the soil. Back then, I was going off of measurements that we'd seen online. So we planted the trees, and because they were still very small, we wanted them to be able to stand up straight without any support. And we planted them pretty deep. At one point, a cat dug up our clementine tree, and my solution was to go back in and add more soil to stabilize the tree even more because some of the roots had gotten torn out, and I thought that would fix everything. So then fast forward a year later, my mandarin tree wasn't doing so hot. It would push out growth and then it would stay there for months on end without any additional growth. It wasn't really branching out. Oftentimes the leaves would fall. My bear's lime tree was doing a little bit better, but it still wasn't in the best condition. Because these 2 trees are semi-dwarfs, they're going to be more compact than a standard tree. But aside from their size, I could just tell by the leaves that they just weren't doing the greatest for the longest time. Then a few days ago, I decided to check their root flare. As you can see, I wound up cutting away some more feeder roots that it started putting out in clusters, because originally this tree was planted a little bit deep in its nursery pot, but then I went ahead and planted it even deeper than that. So all of this was buried. Here's a root flare. Once I uncovered it about up to here, you could see the soil from the nursery pot, which over time has also compacted. But basically what I was doing over the past year was slowly suffocating this tree, and you could tell by the roots. It started developing girdling roots, which means that the roots it started putting out started winding around itself, basically slowly choking itself out, which is why it was still alive, because it was a little fighter, but it wasn't thriving. Over the past year, I've learned exactly what to look for before I plant a tree. I've learned to check the graft. I've learned to check the root flare. I've learned to actually take a good look at the roots and see what I'm working with. Back then, I had no idea. So basically what I did is I started suffocating the tree. It started trying to put out new feeder roots to be able to get more moisture and more nutrients. But on top of it being suffocated by how deep it was planted, I was also suffocating it with the potting mix. I don't even know whether to call it potting mix or not, because it was really just peat moss. And before I had set up a watering system, I was so inconsistent with the watering. Sometimes I watered them too much. Sometimes I went weeks without watering them at all. And when that happened and they dried out far too long, what peat moss does is it becomes hydrophobic. So it repels water up until it's forced to absorb it, and then it holds on to it really, really well. So these poor trees were sitting in soggy soil. I was suffocating them because I buried them far too deep. Honestly, I've even read that if you bury a tree even 1 to 2 inches too deep, it can eventually kill a tree, or it can cause a lot of long-term damage. I had buried mine literally like this much deeper. I still feel so upset with myself. I didn't film the repotting process mostly because I just felt so upset with myself, and I was doing it kind of in a panic because I love these trees so much, and I finally understood why they were kind of stunted for so long. One might look at them and say, okay, but they're alive, they're still green. What's the problem? There's a huge difference between a tree surviving and a tree thriving, and mine were just surviving. Now I want to show you the difference between these and ones that I planted much later that took off way better because I planted them at the correct depth. So here's my bear's lime. Here's my mandarin tree. And these are way younger, but they've branched out way faster than the other ones ever did. And the reason for that is because you can see the root flare. And if I dig in a little bit deeper, start to see some of those feeder roots coming through. These trees can actually breathe and they don't need to struggle to look for moisture or nutrients. I'm pretty sure that by the end of the year, they're going to be even more beautiful than they are now. When I realized that these trees had extremely bad girdling roots, I decided to cut a few of them away, not too many, because if you cut off too much, especially with citrus trees that are evergreen, you can kill a tree just by doing that. I tried to be as gentle as possible and tease some of those roots to help them straighten out. Some wouldn't budge at all, so I did as much as I could without damaging the tree too much, but that also messed with its stability. And because we've had really windy days and these trees have already been through enough, I decided to stake them the way you see now. It's not right up against the trunk, but it's pretty close, because this one in particular can easily get knocked over. And I won't be removing the stakes until about a year from now, maybe sooner, depending on how I see the tree performing. But for right now, I feel like it's just in a recovery process. I'm going to do everything in my power to try and keep these trees alive. But if you guys are planting a tree for the first time or the 100th time, please remember to always check for the root flare. Keep in mind that soil can settle over time, especially if it's in pots. So I always try and plant above grade level now, with the expectation that the soil will go down after about a year, if not longer. And I just want to make sure that these trees don't get suffocated over time. So far I'm hopeful, but I also have to be realistic and understand that these trees have definitely been through a lot. Then again, plants are very resilient, so if they were able to make it over a year in the conditions that I had them planted, I'm hoping that they'll make it through this recovery process.